Well, so maybe Christina, drop in. We're going to do the same practice that we did on the opening of just dropping in a question and letting everybody introduce themselves that way, so we can kind of have a simultaneous chat. And so the question for today to drop into the chat is, what trend do you track in your day-to-day life? What trends are you tracking? And again, it doesn't have to be about finance or gender-based violence. It can be, you know, I think my husband tracks the trends of the Mets pitching capabilities. I don't even know if I'm saying that right, but something about how pitchers work is a trend, and whether or not the Mets are figuring it out. Sorry, that's a very US example, but our New York baseball team. So was a very American example, like not even rugby or something. So what do you track in your day-to-day life in terms of a trend? And just put your name in and drop it in. Hey, Daniela. Good morning. So I think we have a pretty good split. Elizabeth, you're in, are you in Boston? Am I right about this?
Yes, sorry, I'm coordinating different technologies. I'm generally in Boston. I'm in New Hampshire at the moment, hiding from my family, but generally Boston, yeah.
I mean, I'll support that. I've been there. So a few places to go now. I used to travel for a living. That's what I did, was escape my family. Love my family, really do. So. Oh, okay, maybe that's the, all right, I love the LM. Andrew, I was really resonating with your infection rates. Like, I really do watch it every day. I'm so proud that finally the US, or not the US, but our state is going down. Teresa, that's wonderful.
It's so boring. Like these others, I get really excited and motivated by the other ones that are on here, but I'm like, I'm just gonna tell my truth, which is boring.
You are one of those people fully embodied in like a finance person in like the best way, like in a grounded, good kind of let's do this crap kind of way.
Very kind, thank you.
Joyce, I've got a technology issue. I've just sent my response for Christina privately. Do I cut and paste it into, can I forward it somehow? This is where I'm demonstrating my literacy, my digital
copy and paste. If you just swap it down to everyone.
You see where the arrow says to, to everyone in meeting.
Yeah, I'm with Todd tracking.
Do you want to just walk you through quickly?
I've done it.
You've got it?
Okay. Yeah.
LM, you good? So we're in you just open up the chat box, and once you get to the chat box, you should see where everybody's talking. So you'll see a chat box with a bunch of numbers in it. And so Ellen and Amy, oh, hi, Ellen, Amy, Emma. So the question we're asking is, what do you track? What are the trends that you track? One or two. We are very, I mean, again, Teresa, I'll come back to your sort of groundedness in this. You're looking at the long-term macro. Everybody else is like, what's going to happen in November in the United States?
Right. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Presidential polls, good thing to track.
All right. These are so fun. So again, just acknowledging what we're continuing to work towards is to figure out as much as possible how we can jump into a conversation versus a introduction time, and see if we can drive some of that introduction time into other places. So I do actually recommend, like, just maybe one more tech point. If like Vicky just posted something, if I wanted to say something back to just Vicky, which could be, Christina, what might I want to say to Vicky? Might it be
Coming up.
happy birthday?
Oh.
Oh, happy birthday.
Well, together it's gonna be totally asynchronous, but Vicky, happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy
birthday, dear Vicky.
birthday.
Happy birthday to you.
All right, you're on mute. I'll come off mute and say nice things now.
That is so lovely. And that must be Julia that gave it away, right?
Yeah, Julia did a whole scheming thing, got on early, said, ooh.
Oh, thank you, everybody. I know it's a milestone birthday, so it's very exciting.
So milestone birthday that so many on this call has passed. So you seem like a youngin' to me. Just, 50s in the past, in the rearview mirror. So there you go.
50's the new 40.
40's 50 is the new 40. So there you go. All right, so one of the things we're trying to do is, what I wanted to notice is if you wanted to say something other than happy birthday to Vicky, or you wanted to say happy birthday to Vicky, anytime you see a name highlighted, you can just click on that and then you'll be able to message them directly if there's something you want to say just to them, like, hey, I really liked what you just said, or dang, Amy, that's a really great scarf. And so, all of that kind of being able to connect to each other, that's doable. The other thing is, and again, we're all learning how to be better with technology, but in this workplace place, is the backgrounds on all of you. And so if somebody says something and you're like, well, Daniela seems to be speaking from a place of authority, I wonder why she's speaking with so much authority. You can go, oh, right, she's got some fancy ass position at a superannuation fund / pension fund. And so just being able to click over to Workplace where you'll find everybody's bios and things that they're posting. So I realize this is a little bit of multitasking, but thinking about how you get to know people in different ways. But this conversation is bigger than many of the others for mostly logistical reasons. And Teresa and I will establish this is the coolest conversation happening in Convergence because you and I have been trying to have this conversation for a very long time. So I'll just name this one. This one's for you, Teresa. I will just. But in that, where it's a little bit bigger, I'm hoping we can just stay as a group of nicely arranged 16, which is kind of a very symmetrical group. Maybe we could accidentally, Todd, kick off anybody else because this is very nice. But let's see how it goes. If we need to break into a smaller group, we will. And then we'll figure out how we go. We're not going to be able to keep the symmetrical number, but Pat coming is a really cool thing. So Pat's from AVPN. She's amazing. So wonderful to have her here. We won't really talk about our squares anymore anyway. So tonight's conversation is going to be about how do we think about gender-based violence as a megatrend? And what would it mean if gender-based violence could be seen as a megatrend within finance? But before we do that, we're going to do our ritual that we're developing within Convergence of acknowledging. So if everybody takes their hands off your computers, hands up, stop clicking, stop typing, and hold your own hand. However you want to. You can get better at holding it in all kinds of different, oh, I like that one, Pat. So we begin this session with an acknowledgement and a reminder. We are not alone. We have power in our hands. This is not a light topic. And in this conversation, we will intellectualize and abstract a set of very real experiences. These discussions may trigger a wide range of emotions. In this room, statistically, are many survivors of gender-based violence. and we all participate in a political, social, cultural, and economic system that gives permission for and facilitates violence. In fact, violence kills more women between the ages of 15 and 44 than cancer, malaria, traffic accidents, and war combined. But in India, less than 1% of survivors reported gender-based violence to formal sources. So a moment of silence to acknowledge the violence happening in this precise moment, somewhere, to someone. With that in mind, reverse your hands. Hold your hands the other way and notice the difference. We've come together to create new possibilities to address the epidemic of violence in the world, and connected in new ways, we can do even more. Let's begin.
Okay.
The ritual of being able to transition into this. So I want to actually start with, and this is I'm sorry, I'm just mind-bogglingly excited for this group of people together, because you're both some of the smartest people I know working on gender and some of the smartest people I know in finance. And so what you can create together in the next hour and a half is, who knows? So, so this is a framing conversation. We're not going to actually end up, well, maybe we'll create something because we're very efficient men and women. But in this conversation, we're looking to wrestle with some ideas. And so we'll go from framing to strategy to implementation and design, and as we get more practical in future weeks. But this is a framing conversation, and the question we're trying to wrestle with, and Christine and I were talking through this morning, this is really up for grabs. I don't know if gender-based violence is worth thinking of as a megatrend. I think there's lots of problems of thinking it that way, or it might be a breakthrough that we need. We don't know, but we're going to wrestle with that today. We're not going to figure out how to implement it in the next 15 minutes. We're going to figure out, how do we wrestle with this as an idea? And so what I want to start with is maybe just a conversation about megatrends and why are they powerful in finance? Why do people in finance track megatrends and find them so very appealing?
I can start.
Thank you.
So as Joy said, I work for a superannuation fund, a pension fund. And for us, the main reason why we are concerned about megatrends is because we are what's called universal investors. And this means that we can't diversify away from risk. We're invested in a piece of the global economy, so we can't diversify away from risks arising from megatrends. So the only way is by considering and trying to price those in or see how we can perhaps take advantage of them. But it's that issue of diversifying away from risk. This is risk that's always going to be there. There's no companies that we can sell that are going to be not affected by those megatrends.
It's a great opening statement. And I'm just dropping into the chat. I don't know, I Googled someplace earlier before examples of megatrends. We're going to talk in a little bit about how climate change is seen as a megatrend. But this is just a list of like, what do people consider megatrends? What are people tracking when they mean that? Why else is it useful in finance? So, I mean, at that kind of, you can't diversify from risk.
So I can go next. So I work for Trillium Asset Management in Boston. We are very different kind of investors in that we are active investors. So our job is to pick and choose what we invest in. So very different than the superannuation fund. So I've been following clean tech in particular for about 15 years, identifying climate change and renewable energy as a mega trend early in my career. And so we and I see it as my job to be looking for mega trends before they happen to, well, in the case of climate change, for two things. One, because my clients care deeply about that, but also, you know, to help them profit from that. So to realize in advance what changes are likely to come.
Yep. Cool. Very well said.
I can just dovetail off of that too. So Teresa Wells, I work for a large independent wealth advisory firm called Tiedemann Advisors. We're more of an active allocator to many different asset classes and funds and strategies, both in public markets and private markets on behalf of our clients. And I would actually just echo what both Daniela and Elizabeth would say, in that we're trying to identify what those megatrends are and how capital might flow into various different markets or systems in advance or in response to those megatrends. And in some of that, it's to, you know, very much what Elizabeth was just saying, is to, in order to try to preempt any other capital flows that might flow into an asset class or an asset or a system, so that you might be able to take advantage of the uplift from that capital flow. And in other cases, it's to preemptively evaluate the risks associated with that megatrend and ensure you're on the right side of that risk. And in some cases, that's things like with global climate change, it's stranded asset risk, right? It's regulatory risk. It's moving away from certain kinds of solutions that will likely flow on the other side of that.
So,
Hi, Ellen. Yeah.
I'm Ellen Friedman. I'm with the Compton Foundation, based in San Francisco, and I'm not an investment professional, but I have worked in the area of both gender-based violence and gender issues in general for many, many years. And I guess the question I would like to, or the reflection that I have, both from the comments and your list, Joy, is seeing, is questioning the way in which the invisibility of gender plays out in every single megatrend on your list, and raise the question of, without a gender analysis, the way we think about these megatrends actually will be influenced and defined in a way that might in fact harm women. And I can get into some of this later, but there are two studies that I'm thinking about in particular. One is about, we've done a lot of looking at culture and how to shift culture around gender. And one of the things that we've learned is that actually it's very, very, very hard to do that. And people's gendered assumptions are pretty fixed. And so kind of helping to shift the way people think about things like global warming or population growth or pandemics, even with a gender lens, is very difficult. And then the second piece I just want to put on the table is I have a show and tell object, a book called The First Political Order, which was written by Professor Valerie Hudson, who has actually, using data, been able to show that what happens to women in the home impacts violence in every other sector of society. And this kind of information is really not shared widely. And I think it affects the way we think about these megatrends. So I just want to throw that into the conversation.
Cool.
Yeah.
Julia, did you want to throw it?
So I just wanted to, I guess I heard two different things from the speakers. Well, I heard lots of different things, but just wanted to dig down on, so how much, I guess, Elizabeth and Teresa, some to extent, did you, I think I've got the right person, did you feel that the climate change megatrend was promoted through or led through insurance organizations seeing that there was going to be a damage to their balance sheet if they didn't consider climate change, and that sort of created this momentum of considering that risk, and then financial markets saw that there is an investment trend going on here, and then they all got on that, or as compared with, I guess, the social norms and acceptance of damaging the environment sort of drove that trend. So there's two different things here. One is, well, it's actually three, but one is risk mitigation by finance. The other one is just following because it's good and we know there's going to be value there. So let's get in there first, which I think is one of the other things that was addressed. And the other one is the impact of social norms in creating that and creating that movement.
I'm happy to jump in. I mean, Elizabeth, I'd love your thoughts on it too. A lot of the work that I've done around investing with a climate change mindset is actually has nothing to do with the insurance companies and that degree of risk mitigation. It was more around the kind of proliferation of climate science and a reaction to, it's kind of what Elizabeth was saying too, is like trying to visualize, okay, this is what's happening within the climate science world. These are the things that will kind of perpetuate from that. And many of those we haven't actually even fully seen yet, but things around, waterfront properties, golf courses, and irrigation systems, and scarcity of water resources, and, obviously fossil fuel reserves. And so those, kind of thinking through those mega trends, how can we remove the stranded asset risk? Or are there other, and this is one of the things that I get most excited about, are there other creative financial systems that can be put in place that can hospice certain industries, hospice certain of these assets in a way that is less of a cliff and more of a slow, gradual momentum. But from my perspective, it was more around just the climate science and an evaluation of that and where you want to be. I don't know, Elizabeth, if you have other ideas.
Yeah, I would totally agree with everything you said. So, the original question was why would investors or the financial community care about these mega trends? And I guess I would, echoing things that others have already said, that there are two reasons, right? It's mitigating risks and seeking for opportunities. So I was trying to point out that it's not only the risk mitigation side, which is some of what you were getting at in the point about the insurance, which is absolutely part of it, but there's also, as investors, we are always also looking to the future and trying to guess what's coming next. That's part of our job, is to be part fortune tellers, I think.
Yeah, LM, and then we'll jump that to you, Emma. LM.
Okay, yeah, I'm Luisa Maria Carlisle in lovely Brooklyn, and my nickname is LM. Luisa Maria takes too much time. And I'm a certified financial planner, and until about a year or so ago was working with various wealth partners, and certainly on the gender lens investing front. And, and I'm really struck about the fact that the invisibility of gender-based violence and the pervasiveness of it, this kind of the fact that it's an accepted thing, to me kind of makes it a mega stagnation. And I feel like the work that we're doing is to turn the concept mega trends, trending is a verb, that we're raising the the visibility and the possibility that we can make a change in something that is so pervasive and costly, but it has been stagnating. So our work is get this thing trending and show the directions into which it can trend and make visible the risks and the opportunities. I think that's really the work, the underlying work that's being done here.
Or to sort of play off of that for a second, in some ways, patriarchy has hospiced gender-based violence to put it off to the side and say, nobody can look at that, and I'm going to put it off here and just say that it's not a risk off to the side. That might be mixing metaphors, but it sort of feels like we've kept it off the table for so long. Right. So I want to do two things in this conversation. I just want to name the arc, which is to think a little bit about what is a megatrend, what makes a megatrend work, and then shift the conversation to a second set of conversations about, is gender-based violence trending? Like, is it a megatrend, right? And how would we know that? And what would be the data that we would look at? And could we construct an argument that it actually is trending? Because there are people who say it is on a downward direction, right? In individual places it's on upward direction, but it is in many ways on a downward direction. And you have to look at a very long view and a complex set of statistics to see that. But everybody did that. All those scientists did that in climate change. In some ways, we really just haven't done it in as many gender issues. So I want to start with thinking about thinking about a megatrend, what makes a megatrend work. And I think we're making this little bit of a transition to what made climate finance work. But Emma, you were going to throw in something.
I was just wondering, I mean, a couple of points. One is that it seems from that list to me that in a way the way that they're articulated is sort of these, I don't know, scientific structural processes or systems. And there is very clear evidence, I think, that actually gender-based violence intersects with many of those. And there's sort of strong evidence that there's no way to solve many of those without addressing gender-based violence. It's really clear, you know, on climate change, on health, on urbanization, violent extremism, population growth, they're all related. So that's one part, is how do you articulate that? And then I guess my question, I guess, to the finance people is, do you also look at social movements as megatrends? Because the way that these are articulated, you're talking about climate change, but do you also look at the movement around climate activism, or the movement around, you know, Black Lives Matter or Me Too? Do they get considered as megatrends? Because also that seems like a space that these could intersect in an opportunistic way for us.
So I can add some of this, because we've been thinking and we've been talking to other investors and companies deeply about this. And for those that are based here in Australia, we have some great examples happening here with AMP and QBE, which have had senior leadership leave the companies because their actions, some of them related to gender-based violence, have not been aligned with societal expectations. And so this is something we're talking about, shifting societal expectations about inequalities. So society values fairness, and when there's a perception of unfairness, there's a lot of risk for companies from their employees, their customers, and their shareholders. And I really liked what I think Luisa Maria said before about gender-based violence, and it seems to me as if it's something static and stagnated, and if anything, a little bit in the downward trajectory. Not that doesn't make it important and a risk, but it's not something like in climate change that you can see the upward trajectory. But I think what is in an upward trajectory is societal expectations about what's appropriate and what's not. And for me, and I'm sorry to come a little bit with a devil's advocate view. To me, gender-based violence is too niche to be seen as a trend in itself. But I think shifting societal expectations about equality and fairness, and there is a place there for gender-based violence, is absolutely something that could be considered a mega trend, and it has all the characteristics that we would consider them.
Cool beans. What I want to do is I want to take that question of should we consider it as a mega trend and what should we? Let's build towards that, because I think it's a really important question that we can sort of figure out what mega trends are, figure out if it's trending, and then figure out should we call it a trend. Andrew, you've been trying to get in. You've been very polite. Thank you so much.
So I wanted to take advantage of having so many real financiers around the table to do a little bit of comparing and contrasting between green investment and green growth and gender investment and gender-friendly growth. And this comes, again, I work at the Inter-American Development Bank. We're an international organization that works in Latin America and the Caribbean. and I sit in the gender part of the IDB. Gender lens investing is something about which I know very little, and I'm sure most of the people on this call know quite a bit about gender lens investing. I know that it is a fraction of probably what green investing is. And in the international development space where I work, we always have climate envy because there are many more resources available for environmental work than for gender work. And I think there's room for us to ask questions about why that is. And that's what I wanted to put to the finance people around the table. Can gender lens investing be linked to issues of violence against women, or as Daniela said, is that too niche? And Daniela, I think what you said really I found very impactful, that since in most countries, well, I can't say that, in the United States and in many countries in Latin America, we have time series data, prevalence of violence against women has gone down over the last 10 to 15 years. So I don't think labeling it as a mega trend could work, but equality and inclusion perhaps. Thank you.
Well, I just want to posit, if it's trending downward, it's still a trend, right? I mean, it's still, if it's trending upward or downward, it's still a trend. I don't think it gets ruled out because it's trending downward. The question is, what are you betting for or against if gender-based violence is reducing? So I think that
when I hear the term megatrend, I think about population aging. I think about the climate crisis. I think about trends that are going to explode in our faces if we don't do something about it. So that's why I find it hard to think about this as a mega trend. But you may be right, Joy, that, you know, I trained as an economist, so I understand that the slopes can be negative or positive, right? But it's hard for me to think about a mega trend as something that's on a downward glide. Thanks.
Yeah, I get super excited about this because it goes right back to, remember our chart, Joy?
Yep, I remember our chart.
So what's exciting about the fact of gender-based violence going on a downward trend, I think of that in the same mega trend as women going back, or women engaging in the workforce at a material level in the United States after World War II. And if we have a number of women who are no longer in fear, in hospitalization, leaving their work or losing their job because they keep, you know, having to call in sick, or they're under duress, all of those things add to material economic improvement. That is a megatrend. And so if universally we had every nation, had greater policy enforcement, had greater law enforcement around what this looked like, we would reduce the level of negative economic impact that happens because of the fact that all of these women around the world are no longer able to fully actualize themselves in the economy the way that they would maybe otherwise. And that to me is like a huge, to use a nerdy finance parlance term, that's a huge right tail event.
Yeah, Pat, go ahead. Great to have you in then, Ellen.
Well, thank you. This is a fascinating conversation. And I work for AVPN, which is the Asia Venture Philanthropic Network in Singapore. But I used to work with Procter & Gamble for 20 years before that. And a big part of my job was identifying trends. So I find this interesting, and consumer trends there. And I think one thing that we used to watch for was the incidence of that event, or so the statistically, or how, is that happening versus how much do people care about that event. So for example, you might have gender-based violence incidents going down, but the interest that people have in solving it or supporting it might be going up. And the trend was therefore characterized not just on the incidence, but on the interest. And with social media, with connections, you might find the interest in a certain issue increasing, and that makes it a trend. So you're riding more on the interest wave versus the incidence wave. I just wanted to put that out there.
So Ellen and then Amy.
So the thing that this conversation is raising for me is how are we defining gender-based violence? Because yes, there's certain things that are trending down, but what's trending up is anti-gender policies and actions, particularly in the global South and in places that have authoritarian governments, because keeping women home and not engaged in economic activity is a way in which many governments keep control. And so I think that what would be interesting, and we can see that here as well, in terms of the way in which women's access to reproductive health is controlled, and it's harder for women now to get access to reproductive health care. Maternal mortality rates are increasing rather than decreasing. So I wonder if part of what we need to do is zoom out a little bit better, a little bit more, so that we actually look at the range of policies that affect women's economic activity in the way that Teresa articulated, because this really is and must be a holistic understanding of the way in which gender, as I said earlier, intersects with everything that is currently thought of as a trend.
So Amy, then Emma. And wave if I'm missing you.
Thanks, Jo. Look, I just want to start off by acknowledging that I'm joining people from the land of the Ngunnawal country, which is unceded Indigenous territory in Australia. And I think it's important, if we're discussing violence, to talk about the fact that I'm joining you from a country built on a history of colonial violence that continues to this day, and which is gendered colonial violence as well. Amazing thoughts. I just want to add two potentially normal things and one potentially wacky thing. If we're talking about trends, and the feminist in me is fighting with the statistical nerd in me, I think what we can talk about, thank you for laughing, Andrew. I think what we can talk about in terms of gender-based violence is that it's been relatively recently that the evidence has emerged that we can actually stop gender-based violence. And that could be the trend that we're talking about, is that we actually have an evidence base for the interventions that prevent violence from happening and stop it from happening. And so that is new. And so that could be crafted, I think, potentially kind of framed as a trend. I think the other trend that sort of sits alongside that is I think a fairly demonstrable trend that the private sector has a role to play in this discussion. And if we do, as Ellen says, suggested, stand back and look at the broad spectrum of gender-based and patriarchal violence, which also includes things like work-based sexual harassment and sexual assault, there's definitely a conversation happening about the role of employers and investors in changing that story, and indeed the extent to which they can't say that their responsibility stops once you leave your office. And COVID's really pointed that out, since we're all working from home now. So I think those are two things to chuck in the trend pot. The other sort of, I guess, cautionary or risk thing that I think we need to think about, and some of us have raised this already, is that we've normalized gender-based violence. It's the basis of our capitalist system. It doesn't seem to be a threat to democracy anywhere. It's just a normal part of everyone's lives. And so I think there's a risk, as we talk about turning this into a trend as a hook for getting excitement about it, that what we do is we focus on the new kinds of violence against women that are emerging, or the new channels for violence. And so say, oh, well, the stuff that happens in your home when your partner is drunk because the football team lost, that's not our problem. But cyber stalking could be our problem because we own the platforms for that. Or political violence against women facilitated by Twitter, or cyber violence against women, or whatever. All the new things that are emerging because humans are terrible and use new technology to be horrible to each other, potentially could be where the focus goes, because we haven't normalized it, if you see what I mean. And there's already some conversation in Australia, at least, when we talk about e-security, around what is the responsibility of the corporate platforms that sit underneath these new forms of violence. So I don't know whether it's an opportunity or whether that means that there's a risk that we normalize some kind of violence as we chase new and sexy kind of violence. I can't believe I just said that sentence. But those are the thoughts that are swirling for me. Great conversation so far. Thank you.
Emma, can I frame something quickly before you go? Yeah. And then, because I'm noticing a chat on the side, and I think it's a really interesting question of what constitutes a megatrend. And I do want to say a little bit to the trend versus megatrend. I think the specific trends or things that are trendy is not what we're trying to get at. We're looking at something, Danielle, as you said, is sort of it crosses sectors and geographies, that that there's sort of, you want to get at something that is big enough, cross-cutting enough, and in some ways, what I want to name is the one reason to think about it as powerful is to have it get to the level of interest, right? To have resources attached to it, said, oh my gosh, here is this huge thing happening. Women might actually not want, like we're changing the systems, not that anyone wants to be violated, but the kind of question of there's enough momentum that the social movement's behind it or whatever, that there might actually be a shift. And I think getting to what, I want to think maybe it would be helpful to do two questions. One is thinking about what a megatrend is, which is I think sort of the finance conversation, what constitutes a megatrend. And then I want to sort of shift to just looking at the gender angle and saying, what is the level of complexity that is gender-based violence that would make a case for it to be so complex, so prolific, that it constitutes a megatrend? And sort of think about those as maybe in two steps. And so Emma and then Darcy, and then we'll maybe try to do that a little bit.
Thanks. This is so much fun. I love what everyone's saying. I'm trying in my head to, I feel like all these points are connected, and I'm trying to, like, my brain's just kind of trying to join the dots a bit. A couple of things. I want to slightly caution about the idea that GBV is trending down, because I don't know that it is everywhere. It may be in the US and maybe in, you know, some countries, but that's the evidence doesn't necessarily support that in other countries. And I think it's such a moving feast that, you know, you might have some types of violence looking like they're trending down while others are going up, and triggers happen to kind of increase rates of violence. And I just don't think we can argue that yet. But the opportunity for it to trend down has obviously all these massive economic benefits that, you know, Teresa was talking about. And I think maybe the connection, I'm not quite sure, is that there, I don't know whether we'd call it a megatrend, but it's almost like the little like thing in the middle that connects all these other megatrends. Like GBV is related to everything, and also the causes. So we were talking about gender. Is GBV too niche? And maybe GBV might sound too niche, but the causes of gender-based violence, gender inequality, other forms of discrimination and oppression, all of the big things that you're talking about that are megatrends, they are the causes of gender-based violence. So if you can address those, and so GBV sort of feels to me like this little amazing example of a place where everything interconnects. And so if you can address that, the opportunities for, you know, economic benefit, societal progress, equality are so huge that maybe this is the space where you want to engage. And then the final thing I want to say is that I think there's this thing happening right now. And when Andy said, you know, it's maybe not the thing that's going to blow up in your face. But I wonder actually if it is, because I see these two trends happening right now, which is increased interest in this issue. I think it was Pat was talking, a few of you were talking about, but at the same time, this extreme backlash. And when you have dramatic progress and change and social interest and extreme resistance, that is a moment when you can have something fundamentally blow up in your face. And I feel like that's something we should be recognizing, and financial institutions should be seeing that this could be the next thing that does potentially, but just thoughts, random. Thanks.
And then Julia. Darcy, you want to go?
Great. Well, thank you. I'm Darcy Johnson, and I'm an investment manager in the Seattle area. Fulcrum Capital is my firm. And we focus on sustainable investing for clients and nonprofits. But in my off hours, my volunteer time, I joined the In Faith Community Foundation board with Joy Anderson, and we started a fund 5 years ago that is 4 years ago that was dedicated to addressing domestic violence. And this $10 million pool, small by finance standards, was really unique because it was the first of its kind to put all assets behind that one concern and that one issue. It's been really interesting. LM helped us create it, develop it, and manage it. Veris has been a partner linked with us through the whole process. But the thing I really see, and I think our group is constantly driving for, is how gender-based violence, we believe, is a megatrend. And it's not just the people who are violated, it's their families, their children. The run-on effects of it are so damaging that the dollar amount that we can attach to it, and I've seen a few different numbers float around, is gigantic. The opportunity is huge. And I think your point, I can't remember who it was, but that this is a catalytic moment. This is a moment where people are paying attention, people are listening, they're noticing. And I think Black Lives Matter has complemented that, because it is women, minority women, that are impacted even more. So I think it's exciting that this could be the catalytic moment. As an investment manager, I want to know what to buy. I want to know what stocks to pick, which companies to stay away from, which firms to support proxy initiatives for human rights due diligence, and how to drive that change, because that's what my clients want.
So I do the sort of Julia and then Andrew, just taking a point of privilege in here. I think part of that, Darcy, and just for the sake of it, right, we're going to be in, you get to be in like 5 of these kinds of conversations over the next couple of weeks, and other ways to engage with people here at this Convergence. But I think this one, sort of thinking about what is it worth trying. In the systems of finance, megatrends have lots of power. And I find it fascinating. I will just name, there is bias in which gets chosen as a real or big enough megatrend, right? And so some of these megatrends, in my mind, are pretty specific, right? And one of the things that's happened as a parallel, just to put this out there, between climate change and gender lens investing, is that climate gets really specific. Broad megatrend of climate change, and then 17,000 books about every single carbon sequestration that's possible. And when you do a climate shareholder advocacy moment, it is very specific, based in science. And then we should just do gender, because it's bigger, it's big enough. Well, it's in many ways too big, right? Then it's just, what is a trend in gender, right? Then you have to figure out what are the different breakdowns, right? So I do also just want to name, there is bias operating. I'm not suggesting in this conversation, I'm just saying how we think about what gets to be big enough as a trend, that sort of to be a mega trend, is a useful question. I think the secondary question is that worth it for us to do, right? So is it worth it to figure out how it acts as a megatrend, put that out in the world, what would be the advantage to doing that? And what could we galvanize beyond that if that was proven out, which would take officially a shit ton of resources. Julia and then Andrew.
So just actually looking at the chat, this is sort of playing to the comment of Teresa and where is she? Amy. And this is a bit of something, and it's a bit of a different question, is when you're asking people in finance, and you can imagine them any way you want. You can look at Daniela, or you can look at Elizabeth, or you can think about guys in trading rooms. When you're asking them to think about gender-based violence, what is actually the picture that they're thinking in their brain, and what are they actually considering? Are they considering statistics? Are we drawing a picture? We're showing them or describing to them incidences of gender-based violence, because sometimes that is the issue here. So, and then of course you get like, it's not palatable. You know, some people don't want to hear about it. They don't want to think about it. And so they don't want to think about it. They want to think about dealing with it. They certainly don't want to be writing about it and incorporating it into their risk analysis. And this is from, you know, something that I have personally grappled with, because I've been trying to talk to a lot of, you know, board directors who are quite progressive, but they don't want to talk about it either. It's really quite difficult. So you know, I'm not saying this is great. It's a great situation, but I'd love everybody to, or love some input into that aspect. And climate change, you see a storm or a hurricane or something. Okay, so.
Can I just say, Julie, you've just said, oh, sorry, Joy.
No, I just want to, Andrew, would you let her, because she's got to jump, so I'm just going to give it to Danielle, but I'll come back to you next. Go ahead, Danielle, and then we'll come back to you, Andrew, I promise.
I was just going to say that Julia has just said exactly what I've been trying to think, what's the best way of saying it. It's just perception, and whether we like it or not, whether we think, and I think it is a mega trend, but perception matters. And what Julia has just said is absolutely what happens. And we have two choices. One of them is playing the game that the people that are in power play, and try to have a little bit of a Trojan horse and think, okay, what do they want to see, and how can we sneak in gender-based violence so that we actually achieve the ultimate outcome? But I acknowledge that has downsides to it, because we lose some of the complexity and that you need to achieve a real solution. But I personally think that what Julie has just said, and the way it sounds too complex, it's difficult. I can only give specific examples. It's not, and I know that the climate has some of that, but in the end, it comes down to carbon emissions. And that's how we've personally achieved change in our board. We just got our IC to approve HESTA to have a carbon target. And the way we did it is through a carbon footprint. It's not the best measure, but it's something easy to measure. And so that simplicity of message of climate change, in a way, it's what's lacking, I think.
What's the equivalent of carbon emissions? Andrew, what's the?
So something Darcy said, I don't want to use this term lightly, but it kind of generated a little bit of post-traumatic stress for me. Darcy, you talked about how do you attach a number to this? How do you figure out what violence against women costs economies? And is that a way to position this as a huge issue? Many years ago, as a young economist, I generated some of the first estimates of macroeconomic growth costs of violence against women for Latin American countries. And I thought this was the cat's meow. And I thought finance ministers would be lining up as a result of these numbers saying we lose 3% of GDP growth a year to take out loans from development banks on gender-based violence. Obviously, it didn't happen, and I was a little naive. And that's my post-traumatic stress moment. So I think, and what did put this on a public policy agenda in Latin America was the Ni Una Menos movement, and women, hundreds of thousands of women in the streets saying, we're not going to put up with this anymore. It wasn't economists with, as much as I'd like to think generating cost data would move public policy. At a macro level, it didn't. Now, let me say something that's a little contradictory. GIZ, the German Development Cooperation, has done a series of studies for, I think, 5 Latin American countries, where they have estimated the costs of intimate partner violence for firms. And this, I think, they've aggressively disseminated this information. And I think at least some private sector firms, I'm in the Andean region, are now very interested in this, to the point where in the next year, the Inter-American Development Bank is going to be developing a virtual platform to try and help firms reduce violence against women within firms and sexual harassment. So I guess what I'm saying is costing data isn't, and getting to people's minds about financial costs at a macro level, I don't think is an easy way to position this as either a megatrend or an important issue, or whatever you want to say. But I think perhaps at a more micro level, at the firm level, it might be, especially because some of these studies show how much more poorly firms perform as a result of their female employees suffering violence. Thanks.
Cool. Amy, then Ellen, and then I want us to think about a shift for the last 30 minutes, so 2 more comments, but I want to think about a shift and sort of say, okay, interesting, really important and really important conversation about, should it be a mega trend? Could we make it a mega trend? What would it take? Sort of, is it possible? I want to see if we can shift in the last 30 minutes to sort of say, putting aside, should we do it? One of the reasons we don't know should we do it is we've never actually figured out what would it take from a research perspective to show it, right? And so I want to think a little bit about, because part of what happens is we say, well, we don't have enough research. And then we end up, we could do this, but we don't have enough data, but we never get to, well, what would it take to have enough data to prove that one of the most ubiquitous trends on the planet, one of the most ubiquitous experiences on the planet could be a megatrend, right? And what would it take to prove that in its materiality to finance? So I want us to think, maybe sort of shifting your brains a little bit to say important debates. We're not saying let's go do this, but if we did it, what would it take? And so Amy and Ellen, and then maybe we can shift to that sort of what makes this possible question for a second.
Thanks, Joy, and thanks everyone for your genius insights. I'm very much enjoying myself this morning. I wanted to ask a question of the investors in the virtual room, and some of you may be aware there's been a recent scandal in Australia where a man with a conviction inside his company of fairly gross sexual harassment that he was fined for by his company was made the head of the company. And then at the end of last month, there was a shareholder backlash and he resigned, as did the board of the chair. So in a quite short amount of time, and this is off the back of a long series of scandals in Australian banking around charging dead people, possibly money laundering, maybe financing terrorism. This got a really quite quick shareholder backlash and 2 people lost their jobs. And then yesterday, and I've just shared the link in the chat, there's a group in Australia called Male Champions of Change, which are high-level executives that sort of buy into a role for their companies in normative behaviour, and they've put out a report that is essentially says the way we've been doing sexual harassment and in the workplace isn't working, and we need to shift the accountability structures to create cultural safety for those who experience this and transparency around what's happening instead of a bunch of non-disclosure agreements, which means that everyone can get on their merry way. I see workplace sexual harassment as part of the continuum of violence against women. And I think it can be packaged up like that. But I'm interested from investors to hear, like, does that make you go, holy shit, there's a risk there because my shareholders could turn on me and boot out people? And like, I just looked at the share price and they were definitely losing share price until that situation was fixed and they bounced after it. So to me, that's inaction, the intolerance for this kind of stuff continuing in a fairly material way in the last just 2 weeks in Australia. And just how does that resonate with the financiers?
I think Ellen, and then feel free to light up the chat. Ellen?
Well, my comment actually is a little tied to what Amy just said, but I think to your question, Joy, about research, I actually think we need to dive into the role of unconscious bias in the investment decision-making process, because I think it's a really big barrier. And I earlier linked to a series of reports from a group called Story at Scale that did, there's a report in there from the Perception Institute that looked at the role of unconscious bias in limiting progress in the United States context on gender because of unconscious bias. And I think that's an element. Part of what we need to do is have systems and structures and policy and no cultural support, like for what Amy just described. But I also think this work has to dig deeper, because if we don't deal with unconscious bias, we will have a backlash. And I think that's some of what we're seeing now in the rise of anti-gender policies around the world. I think it's some of what we're seeing here in the United States in terms of the last gasp of a hold on white male power. And so I think that understanding both the structural, but the psychological barriers to advancing this work is a piece of research that really needs to be done more deeply.
Yeah. Well, and I just think I do wonder, just coming back to the comparison with climate, while there was something to sell in climate, right? There were ideas that people needed to change, and there were deeply held beliefs that needed to be disrupted. I would venture to say, and I am not an environmentalist, so forgive me, but they're not as deeply held as the patriarchy, right? Just suggesting that there's, and I think, Ellen, to your point, they're connected, right? Some of those.
That's what I was going to say. They're deeply connected. But the issue is not dissimilar in that people had a hard time intellectualizing why climate issues were important to pay attention to now. And people also need to understand why gender is important right now. And it's fear, frankly, that drove the climate issue. And I don't think we want that to drive the gender investing issue.
I wouldn't mind if what people were fearing is that culture change was happening to shift tolerance, and that there were backlashes, but that it was the culture change that we're actually tracking. I just want to lay out a little bit, because if we were thinking about what is the megatrend, I want to think about if we tried to name gender-based violence as a megatrend, what are we actually naming as the statistical body of evidence that we would track as a trend? Right? And I think that is one of the interesting questions. And I just want to name, for those of you who know less about gender-based violence data, one of the key issues in tracking data around gender-based violence is that incidence data is counterindicative often, right? If incidence data goes up, it's actually because in many cases, reporting is going up, which means that the situation has actually gotten better. So we've got an inherent challenge. If the trend is incidence data going up or down, you're going to end up with a really bizarre picture of invalidating success. And so, Emma, you know this way better than I do. I'll defer to you.
No, I mean, I'll share a bit about what data exists, but I'm super curious to know from the finance perspective, what's the data you need to sell whatever it is that you need to sell. Because we have, so many countries have data now on prevalence, which is like what percentage of women experience violence. we have a lot on cost, so we know what's the economic cost when you add in all, you know, health, policing, social costs of violence. We know, as Amy has said, we know that violence is preventable. We know that there's specific programs that significantly reduce rates of violence. We have the start of evidence to show that at a population level, we've seen decreases in rates of violence at a whole. So for example, the most recent example is from Nicaragua, where they've seen like a 70% decrease in actual prevalence, not incidents, of violence over like a 30-year period. And fascinatingly, and there's also evidence to support this globally, that one of the big catalytic kind of drivers of that decrease is social movements and the women's movements. And that's globally the case. So we have that data, we know what works, we can sort of package up and say, okay, if you invested in this, this is likely to have an impact. But I guess then, so the question, yeah, I guess my question is not simple, like it's not super simple messaging like carbon emissions as a single solution. But so I guess my question is, what is the data piece that, you know, if you could magically have something from the finance side, what would that be?
So Teresa, I'd love to come to you. I also want to, I was actually going to come to you and I was going to call on you and you raise your hand. Teresa, I love you so much. But I want to take a moment also though, because I just want to take a moment here, and this is maybe because this is the world I live in, of before we jump to a single data point, or what's the most compelling data point, or what is the dot point that we could package up for people that would change their mind. I want to say that we just did this, we're putting out this research on comparing the development of the field of gender lens investing to the development of the field of climate finance. And one of the comparisons in that is that ClimateWorks, one US organization, received $100 million of money to grant two organizations to build the data sets around climate finance. $100 million. And so part of the challenge that we're at is nobody's putting $100 million in there, in part because I want to argue we're letting them say, simplify it to your one point, just make your point. Well, we have to buy into it. They're like, okay, but actually we need to figure out what is the bigger analysis. One of the other things I just want to name is to make something like this work. I actually think, Emma, it was really amazing to sort of talk about the prevalence versus the incidence questions. And you said if we know the cost, we know the prevalence and the incidence, we know the preventability. What people don't seem to be doing much about is what the future is, right? There's so much of the effort of building the field around gender-based violence over the last 10 years of evidence has been to simply prove undeniably that it happens, right? And that, I mean, similar to climate, right? It was just, no, not really. That's not really a problem. It's okay. It's not really a problem. And so all that has really happened on the data front is taking 10 years to prove this, the sort of ubiquity of gender-based violence. And so partly what I want to imagine here, and Teresa, is where I'm inviting you to join me in this, which is sort of, okay, if we're starting here and saying we're going to prove this out as a mega trend that affects all industries, all sectors, that is this kind of massive force in our world that is going, some part of it is going up and down, whether it's tracking whether tracking the norms piece, or probably not the incidence piece, maybe the costing piece, maybe the cost of solutions, which is minute compared to the cost of the problem. But if we are trying to create that overall, anyway, I'll just cede it over to you, Teresa. You can talk now. That was I lost.
No, I think I'm not going to offer insight on what is that piece of data. So I'm just dispelling that right now. the challenge that I see with this, and it, honestly, if you backtrack to even like, and I know we keep drawing these parallels between climate and here because it's easy and everyone seems to be familiar. When you went back like 20, 30 years ago and we're trying to like find evidence, it also didn't exist, right? Over that time period though, we all came into some kind of an awareness around like, all right, can we at least coalesce around a few things that are seemingly objective that we can call upon to hold different countries, industries, companies, and sectors accountable to. And with that data, it goes all the way back to what Darcy was asking about earlier. With that data, we can then draw comparisons around where we want to put capital in order to create a system of change, and where we want to restrict or remove capital because of the fact that they're not operating the right way. And again, that could go from country, sector, industry, company. And certainly there are a number of different ways that we're infusing capital, and I would love to hear more from all of you, because this, especially in the private sectors, that's where I get super jazzed, is like ways that we can catalyze that change by infusing capital into certain ideas and systems that are promoting, frankly, female and gender, are all gender empowerment, so that they are in a position of power to not, be subjected, hopefully, to that in the same degree. But it also comes all the way back down, like big money moves in public markets, and right now public markets don't know how to figure out this stuff, right? They don't have like objective metrics that someone's accounting for and publishing on a Bloomberg that then you can go and actually like compare people, compare things against, and they're struggling with it. And I think they want that, they desire it, they're looking for it, but it's not there yet. I don't know if that's getting to your point, Joey, but that was what was coming up for me.
We have women on boards, Teresa. We have solved the problem. Amy.
Nope.
Problem solved. I wanted to engage in a little bit of a thought experiment. I've just gone back and looked at the megatrends, Joy, that you put in the chat, and I wonder if we take climate out. Okay, let's just leave that one to the side now and look at the rest of them. They're not financed in the same way. They don't have scientifically backed catastrophic end dates. They don't have massive multilateral financing instruments sitting behind them, or massive multilateral government agreements sitting behind them. So I guess my two questions are these other sorts of trends engaging the interest of investors in the private sector? And if so, what can we learn from trends that exist, I guess, in more ambiguity or longer roads down which we can kick cans before we all die in the heat death of the universe? Or in fact, do we look at those and say the private sector and investors aren't engaging with those either? So I'm trying to let's take climate change out of the mix and look at the rest of the mega trends and see if we can learn anything there.
Because they're not nearly as impressive as the world is going to blow up in 10 years. They're kind of, maybe the population one's complicated. That used to be very hot.
I feel like there's a soil and green thing on the horizon, but.
Can I ask a question, Joy? And perhaps somebody has said this before. I heard somebody talk about unconscious bias. Are there any insights we can get from behavioral finance and kind of what makes people dismiss things that are obvious and consider others? Are there any insights? Because I have the feeling that even if we nail the massive piece of research that will prove everything, we might still be facing a lot of challenges. And
I just have to add one like really quick. Like Julia nailed this earlier too. I mean, she was like, when you bring this up in a boardroom of men, like there's no faster way to get them to recoil in discomfort than talking about something like gender-based violence, which is so prevalent. So to your point, Daniela, yeah, like it's an uncomfortable subject that we have to figure out how to get everyone to listen to.
I've been becoming a nerd on behavioral science over the last year. I'm not all the way there yet, but I think the key point from behavioral science, to answer your question, is how do you make a data point salient? How do you drive it home to someone? And this is, Teresa's related to what you say. It needs to be both salient and not make all the men in the room curl up in a fetal position and be unwilling to talk about it. And I don't know what that's called in behavioral science. It's not salience. Thanks.
Yeah, I think sometimes it's called avoidance, which is an interesting piece, right? Of like, but I think it's a really good point, and I would actually point you back in the chat. I was trying to find it, Christina. Maybe you can find it. You know more of this. The research that Ellen Friedman referenced, who just like, I'll just say, join me in enjoying Ellen over the next couple of weeks. She's one of my favorite people. But in the one of the things she referenced was sort of studies on gender norms, right? There is an intersection between the shifts in gender norms and the stories we tell about gender and what data points are salient, right? That kind of, how do you make a case for change, recognizing that there are some people who are actually the gender norms are shifting, right? And that, I would say for me, the piece that actually is the case that gets financed overall is the most consistent win that I get on gender is that if you're making decisions based on gender norms, you are on average 5 to 10 years behind actual behavioral shifts, and so you're right. So at some level, getting it out that norms-based, decision-making based on what the normative behavior is so likely out of date that you're sort of highlighting what the implicit bias is and what people are counting. And so then the question is, what doesn't get backed up, and what's been hard in systems of gender is there isn't as clearly a future of gender that you can then say, and here's the direction it's changing that you need to pay attention to. And I will say one of the things we're fundamentally missing compared to a lot of these other megatrends is a story of the future. And I think in some ways it's not the data about where it is right now. It is a set of, and this was our morning conversation, this Aquilo that's launching, Jessica Manon, we're looking at what's the predictive modeling around gender patterns that could, and gender-based violence in particular, obviously, but what is the predictive modeling that would let us look out into the future and run some of those models? Because that's the data point. The compelling data point is, here's a future that you're going to lose in. And we don't have that picture of the future. We just have data about the problem now. And I think that's a kind of consistent issue, which, yeah, go ahead, Emma.
Can I make one tiny point on the language? I totally hear everyone. And I think we don't need to necessarily always use the language of GBV. And I think actually the reality is that to solve gender-based violence, we actually don't need more gender-based violence programs, because there's no way you can solve a problem on this scale by, standalone gender-based violence programs. I think we need to be integrating what we know, addressing the root causes of violence, which are, gender inequality, other forms of injustice, etc., in broad sectors. So whether that's integrating into climate justice work, whether it's integrating it into, economic empowerment or infrastructure work, for me, the solution is sort of like almost surreptitiously like embedding it into everything else that is happening anyway. So in a way, maybe the argument isn't let's do more gender-based violence work. It's like, let's make all of this other work more effective by embedding the kind of gender-based violence perspective into it. And so maybe you can, I think we don't always have to go to the boardroom and say, let's work on gender-based violence, if that makes sense. I think there's a way to get the result we want being a little bit more nuanced in that language, potentially.
Potentially, absolutely. It doesn't have to be the headline. So I'm wondering, we are 10 minutes from the end of this, I don't know, from my perspective, glorious conversation with you amazing men and women. And so I'm wondering if we can just take, well, maybe a breath breathing's good. I think breathing's a very important thing. Oh, so many thinking, so many ideas swirling. With that, what's the thought that's coming to you about this conversation? What are you going to take forward from this into the rest of Convergence or the rest of your day? But maybe just the question or thought that you're taking from this conversation into the rest. And I'm maybe going to call on some folks who have been a little quieter. Siri, can I call on you, my good friend?
You can. And thank you, everyone. I'm really, really enjoying this discussion. So some quick reflections, and I am not from the finance sector per se, but I come from the philanthropic and impact investing sectors, which also I think very much have an intersection into financial systems, particularly because many of the investors or owners of companies, private companies in philanthropy and impact investing in the finance sector. And so the biases that we're talking about that play out are very prevalent in philanthropy, which is why we have such complexity, I think. So just some general comments. I really agree that gender and the issue of gender-based violence underlies everything. And when we talk about the complexity, for me lies in when we talk about a future, Joy, that you're talking about, what is the future of gender? I feel like you're asking me, what is the future society we want? Mm-hmm. And none of our world has really worked that out. We're in meltdown in many places at the moment. And so I take it back, you know, to my place here, and I feel, you know, what is the future world we want and what's the role of gender in that is important, because that does set the tone. I feel culture, which is values, behaviours, what we believe in each of our different worlds and countries, because it sometimes plays out differently, underpins what we bring into the financial sector and the way that our financial experts, many who are here today and thankfully speaking so beautifully on this topic, but influences the way that you all assess risk and the way our shareholders perhaps perceive what's important. But I think society, and that's the shareholders and stakeholders, increasingly at local levels are starting to mobilise around what world they want and what future they want to see. And this is bigger to me than a mega trend. This is a massive shift in the way the human race wants to reframe outside of capitalist systems, patriarchal systems, whatever lens you bring to that. And so for me, I think there's a massive opportunity to influence on this issue around financial systems as well as in them. I feel that because there's players, and the naming and shaming, if you like, that we're seeing in Australia at the moment at a company level is one way to make it real for people as well, because individuals and many of them white older men are being challenged publicly in their own community to change. And it has to start at that level, individuals. Absolutely. So, I mean, you know, it's not certainly my view is not coming at the complexity of financial systems per se and the way asset classes are looked at and the way you might assess risk. But actually all of that happens further down the track, because in the end, if you don't have individuals and particularly organisations coming up and looking at things and prioritising a gender lens, then no issue, including climate. I mean, I've just come off the back of working with a tech entrepreneur who is putting more money in climate than anyone else in Australia, and he does not bring a gender lens to climate. So you can understand where he's putting his money is not necessarily solving the complexity of the problem. And he does look at it as a scaling proposition, which is about fossil fuels. So I think we have a challenge that simplification of the issue is actually not going to solve gender-based violence. That was a ramble, but that's how
well,
I'm
it's nice
feeling.
to have your voice. It's great to have your voice in the conversation. So great to have your voice in the conversation. I'm wondering if we can do a little bit of a popcorn in the last 5 minutes of just a few, what are you taking into the next conversations, Ellen?
Well, I love this framing of, you know, what kind of world we want. And I'm struck also by the concrete examples are sometimes what people need, and two come to mind. One is I was able to visit housing for survivors of gender-based violence that is built in the Bronx, and specific New York State bonds financed it. And to walk through the facility, to actually see the cheery rooms, you know, where the kids were and the supportive services was really powerful, because this is what the future could look like, you know, like our path to the future. And the other thing that struck me too was that something like 2/3 to 3/4 of the residents in these buildings were children. Every, you know, mostly woman was bringing children. And then the other concrete example is this In Faith Foundation portfolio, where you actually have a demonstration model of how can you tackle the complexity of gender-based violence by investing in access to employment, access to education, access to housing, you know, bonds, you know, private equity, corporate companies. So anyway, that's, I come back to specific examples of how the solution can be solved that move people, that touch them.
Well, what I just want to say, as your closing comments are starting whole new conversations, and I'm so glad we're going to be doing this for 3 weeks. So you get to keep weaving these conversations through. Pat or Elizabeth, do you have thoughts at the end? I want to make sure voices that haven't talked as much can jump in. You've been active in the chat. Pat?
Well, I'll be very quick because we're running out of time as well. But one of the first phrases I learned as a child was, where there is a will, there is a way. And I think this session just brought that to life. I think with so many people just engaging on the topic, we'll make progress. So I leave this discussion optimistic, Joy.
Great, thanks, Pat. Elizabeth, any thoughts? You're on mute.
Sorry about that. I'll be quick as well, and I'm just really struck by all of the connections that we're noting between the different trends, megatrends, themes, and how attitudes towards gender are interwoven into all of them. And so exploring this issue is really exploring all of the issues.
Yeah, well said, well said. So with this, we're going to sort of make a call at the end of each conversation to see whether or not we think this was a conversation worthy posting on our lovely workplace and letting other people experience. I would give it a hearty yes. I can imagine a lot of people would learn from this conversation. So we'll sort of, yay, great. And I also just really want to acknowledge Laura and Christina. You have politely been quiet to let others talk, but these are amazing voices in this, and they've just been quiet to let you all talk, but I would really encourage you to have conversations with both of them.
So many thoughts after this conversation.
I know, I cannot wait to get into your brain, Christina. So
if everyone on Australian East Coast wants to debrief after this, I am around and swimming.
Yeah, after drinks in the morning in virtually in Melbourne while locked down. So anyway, with that, we've got just 1 minute left. I just want to thank you for your generosity of your time in joining Convergence, and we'll think about how these continue to weave together. Feel free to, I don't mean this just like a promotional go to workplace and post, but like, I think there's some thoughts that are starting to be shared there. So if there are resources, we'll take everything that was named as resources here and drop them into this session and see if we can continue to pull things out. But and then on Monday, there's the first recap that will start to weave together the first 5 sessions and what were the threads through those 5 first sessions. So And then somewhere between now and then, we're also going to all sleep. So yay. Well, with that, have a wonderful day, and just so honored that you're all with us. So thank you.
Thank you so much,
Bye,
Joy.
everyone.
Great
Thank you so
conversation.
much.